Have you ever wondered why silence unsettles a man more than anger, more than tears, more than any storm of words you could unleash? Silence carries a weight he cannot measure, a mirror he cannot shatter. It is not emptiness. It is a force, a quiet authority that speaks to the deepest corners of his psyche, to the places he would rather keep hidden. Carl Jung once suggested that the unconscious speaks in symbols, and silence is one of the most profound symbols a woman can wield. It does not beg. It does not explain. It does not bend. It simply is. And in its stillness, a man is forced to confront himself. When a woman speaks endlessly, his ego can resist, debate, dismiss. Words give him something to push against, something to rationalize. But silence, feminine silence, leaves no handhold for his defenses. It compels him to enter the labyrinth of his own mind, where shadows loom and unresolved fears whisper. A man, stripped of external dialogue, begins to wrestle with his own inner voice. What he hears there often terrifies him, for it is not your silence he fears. It is his own inadequacy reflected in it. The feminine silence is not passive, it is active presence. It is the moon that does not chase the sun, yet commands the tides. It is the still lake that reveals the distorted image of the one who gazes into it. When you refuse to fill the air with words, with justifications, with pleas, you awaken a primal discomfort within him. He is left to project, to imagine, to feel the weight of his own guilt or longing. Jung would call this the projection of his shadow, the parts of himself he cannot bear to acknowledge. In your silence, those shadows rise. Most women believe that speaking more will bring clarity, that explaining, persuading, arguing will move a man's heart. But in truth, it is silence that makes him feel the absence of you, the gravity of you, the possibility of losing you. He cannot escape the echo chamber of his own psyche. Every man carries an anima, the feminine archetype within his unconscious, and when confronted with real feminine silence, he is forced into dialogue with that inner presence. He senses both the mystery and the threat, the allure and the danger. He cannot control it, and so he feels powerless before it. There is a strange power here, a power that does not scream, does not plead, does not demand. It is the power of restraint, of sovereignty, of a woman who knows she does not need to perform for attention. To remain silent in a world obsessed with noise is to embody a kind of sacred rebellion. Stoic philosophers understood this well. Seneca wrote that anger chains us to the actions of others, but restraint frees us. Silence is not weakness, it is self-command. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself that the best revenge is not to resemble those who injure us. In silence, you rise above the battlefield of petty words, and suddenly the man must face the battle within himself. You may not realize it, but silence forces him to imagine your thoughts. He begins to wonder, is she disappointed in me? Has she seen through me? Is she detaching? His mind fills the void with fears and fantasies. Where you once handed him explanations, now you hand him mystery. And mystery is more powerful than any argument. The male psyche is drawn to what it cannot fully grasp, compelled by the unknown. Silence cloaks you in that unknown, making him chase answers he cannot obtain. In the quiet, his ego feels abandoned, stripped of validation. For many men, a woman's attention is the mirror that sustains their fragile sense of self. When that mirror grows still, when it refuses to reflect, he confronts the emptiness of his own self-image. This is why silence can feel unbearable. It exposes the dependency of his identity on external affirmation. Jung would say that individuation, the journey to wholeness, requires facing this emptiness. Yet most men run from it, distracting themselves with noise, with conquest, with arguments. Your silence gives him no escape. But understand this. Silence must come from strength, not from wounded withdrawal. If it is born from fear, he senses it as emptiness. If it is born from self-possession, he feels it as presence. True feminine silence is not about closing your voice, but about opening your soul to its own dignity. It is the refusal to explain your worth to someone who cannot see it. It is the recognition that your value does not depend on his understanding. In that stance, your silence becomes luminous, magnetic, undeniable. He will replay your stillness long after words would have faded. Words can be forgotten, twisted, dismissed. But silence lingers. It becomes a ghost in his mind, a haunting he cannot silence with logic. He remembers the way the air grew heavy, the way his heart raced with questions. He remembers that you did not beg, that you did not collapse into noise. He remembers that you remained untouchable, and that memory reshapes the way he perceives you forever. This is the paradox. The less you speak, the more he hears. The less you reveal, the more he imagines. The less you chase, the more he follows. Feminine silence is not emptiness. It is the echo of eternity within the human heart, and when a man encounters it, he stands face to face with his own shadows, with his own soul. Silence, when embodied by the feminine, becomes a kind of initiation ritual for the male psyche. It is as if he has been led into a temple where no words are spoken, where only the echoes of his own conscience resound. In that sacred space, he discovers the truth he has always sought to avoid: that his power, his bravado, his carefully constructed mask can crumble when confronted with what cannot be controlled. Words he can fight, pleas he can dismiss, even anger he can absorb and return with equal fire. But silence disarms him. It forces him into reflection, and reflection for many men is far more dangerous than conflict. In Jungian terms, silence is a bridge into the unconscious. When a woman withdraws her words, she withdraws a veil that protected him from himself. Now he must stare into the mirror of his anima, the inner feminine image that resides deep within him. That image is often distorted, wounded, shaped by past experiences with women, his mother, his lovers, his rejections, his traumas. Your silence awakens that image and magnifies it. Suddenly, you are not just you. You are every woman he has ever loved, every absence he has ever feared, every judgment he has ever dreaded. This is why silence is unbearable. It awakens the archetype, and he cannot separate you from the weight of his own unconscious history. Consider this. When you choose silence instead of words, you create mystery, and mystery is irresistible to the human psyche. We chase what we cannot fully define. We obsess over what remains just out of reach. The male ego, wired for conquest, interprets silence as a challenge it cannot solve. It gnaws at him. It keeps him awake at night. What is she thinking? Has she withdrawn her love? Has she judged me unworthy? The more he wonders, the deeper your presence embeds itself in his mind. This is not manipulation. It is the natural consequence of presence without explanation. You cease to be predictable, and in becoming unpredictable, you become unforgettable. Yet feminine silence should never be mistaken for passivity. It is not the silence of suppression, but of sovereignty. It is not the silence of a woman too weak to speak, but of a woman who does not need to. It is the silence of queens and goddesses, of figures who command without raising their voice. Think of Athena, who embodies wisdom and restraint, or the Virgin Mary, who radiates sacredness in quietude. Their silence was never weakness. It was the source of their aura. In you, this same power lives. When you refuse to justify your worth, when you resist the urge to chase, you stand in that lineage of women who let silence speak louder than sound. But why does silence wound the male psyche so deeply? Because it exposes the truth, that his control over you was an illusion. Many men thrive on reaction. They measure their power by how deeply they can stir your emotions. If they can make you cry, beg, or rage, they feel validated. But silence robs them of this validation. It is the refusal to participate in his drama. In that moment, he realizes he is not the author of your story, but merely a passing character. And that realization crushes the ego, because the ego feeds on importance. Silence starves it. Stoic wisdom confirms this. Epictetus said, "It's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters." Your silence is the refusal to react. It is not coldness, but discipline. It tells him, without words, that his actions do not determine your value, that your peace is untouchable. And there is nothing more terrifying to the fragile male psyche than a woman who cannot be broken, who cannot be dragged into chaos. In that moment, you become what Jung might call the self, whole, indivisible, radiant in autonomy. Notice how silence transforms the battlefield. In noise, you are both combatants. In silence, you are the judge. He begins to perform before your silence, desperate for approval, desperate for signs of forgiveness or attention. He will fill the void with explanations, excuses, even confessions. Silence compels him to speak more than your words ever could. He unravels, not because you have attacked, but because you have withdrawn the fuel of his ego. And in that unraveling, he reveals himself. But silence also protects you. It is a shield against the temptation to lower yourself, to explain your worth to someone blind to it. It reminds you that your dignity is not negotiable, that your value does not depend on how many words you spill to defend it. The woman who learns this lesson begins to rise above manipulation, above the traps of ego entanglement. She learns the art of sacred restraint, the discipline of being unmovable. She becomes the calm in the storm, and in that calm, men either crumble or rise. And so, silence is not absence. It is presence intensified. It is the paradoxical roar of stillness, the unspeakable language that reshapes a man's perception. When a woman embodies silence with strength, she is no longer merely a participant in his story. She becomes the archetype that defines it. She becomes the lesson he cannot escape, the mirror he cannot ignore, the force he cannot command. There comes a moment in every man's life when he encounters a silence so profound that it feels like judgment, though no verdict has been spoken. It presses against his chest, lingers in the back of his mind, and unsettles the order he clings to. This is not the silence of neglect or indifference. It is the silence that emanates from feminine sovereignty, the kind that requires no justification, no performance, no apology. And when he faces it, something deep within him stirs, something ancient, something Jung called the confrontation with the shadow. The shadow is not merely his darker impulses. It is the collection of all he denies, all he represses, all he refuses to see. When a woman chooses silence, she becomes a vessel through which that shadow emerges. He projects onto her everything he fears about himself: weakness, failure, inadequacy. Your silence is not the cause of his discomfort. It is the stage upon which his hidden actors step forward. He cannot bear it because it reveals him to himself. And men, far more than they admit, are terrified of self-recognition. Silence dismantles the illusion of control. Men are taught to believe that words are weapons, that logic and persuasion can master any situation. Yet, when you withdraw speech, you withdraw the battlefield itself. There is nothing to attack, nothing to dismantle, nothing to resist. He is left alone with the reverberation of his own conscience. Think of it as the difference between fighting an enemy and staring into a mirror. An enemy can be defeated. A mirror cannot be escaped. This is why the greatest psychological impact often comes not from confrontation, but from absence. It is the gap that gnaws at him, the unanswered message, the pause that stretches too long, the gaze that does not break into words. Silence makes him imagine, and imagination is far more punishing than reality. A spoken rejection he can rationalize. A storm of anger he can frame as irrational, but silence leaves no explanation, no closure. His mind spins endlessly, filling the void with fears and fantasies, each one more consuming than the last. And in this way, your silence becomes louder than any speech. Women throughout history have intuitively known this. In ancient myths, goddesses rarely needed to shout. They were often depicted as silent judges, their presence alone enough to inspire reverence or fear. The feminine archetype in its highest form does not prove itself. It radiates. And radiance is always silent. The sun does not explain its light. It simply shines. The moon does not announce its pull. The tides obey without question. So it is with a woman who embraces silence. Her power is not announced, it is felt. But the true strength of silence lies not only in its impact on him, but in its transformation of you. To choose silence is to practice discipline over impulse. It is to refuse the temptation of reaction, to stand rooted in your own ground. Seneca warned that speaking in anger enslaves us, because in those moments our emotions belong to another. Silence, by contrast, belongs entirely to you. It is your fortress, your sovereignty, your refusal to be moved by forces outside your control. In it, you reclaim yourself. Understand, though, that silence is not meant to punish. Punishment still centers the man as the object of your energy. True silence centers you. It is not about withholding words to manipulate. It is about rising so high above the need for explanation that you no longer seek validation from those unwilling to see. In silence, you are no longer trying to change him. You are choosing to remain whole, regardless of him. That is why it has power, because it is not aimed at him, yet it transforms him nonetheless. And here lies the paradox that breaks the male psyche open. The more you detach, the more he feels attached. The more you release, the more he clings. The less you explain, the more he demands answers. This is not because you are playing a game, but because silence touches a truth deeper than words. The truth that love, respect, and presence cannot be begged into existence. They must be freely given. When you embody this, you become untouchable, and in that untouchability, you become unforgettable. Imagine his mind after such silence. He replays the moments, searching for clues. He questions himself. Did I do something wrong? Did I fail to meet her standards? Has she grown beyond me? Every thought circles back not to you, but to him. Your silence turns the gaze inward, forcing him to confront what he avoids when you are still speaking. This is why men often regret most deeply the women who refused to argue, who walked away with quiet dignity. Words can be countered, but silence remains an open wound. And yet, the strange power of this silence is not destruction, it is transformation. For some men, it becomes a catalyst, pushing them to grow, to face their shadows, to step into the man they were meant to become. For others, it becomes a torment, a reminder of what they lost by failing to recognize the gift of your presence. In both cases, silence leaves its mark. It is never neutral. It either awakens or it haunts. In the depths of a man's psyche, silence becomes a mirror he cannot escape. He begins to realize that the absence of words is not an absence of meaning, but rather an amplification of it. What you withhold resounds louder than what you could ever say. Silence is the language of the unconscious, and in its stillness, a man begins to hear the whispers of his deepest fears, the cries of his unmet needs, and the echoes of his forgotten wounds. It is there that Jung's teachings about the anima take root. Every man carries within him an image of the feminine, a hidden presence that shapes his desires and anxieties. Your silence awakens this inner figure, forcing him into dialogue with what he has long suppressed. He will project onto you qualities that are not yours to bear. If his anima is wounded, he will imagine judgment, abandonment, rejection. If his anima is idealized, he will feel awe, longing, obsession. Either way, your silence does not create these responses. It reveals them. You become the catalyst, the symbolic figure through which his unconscious speaks. And this is why silence feels so dangerous to him. It does not answer, it exposes. It does not soothe, it summons. He is left facing the abyss of his own inner world, and most men would rather face an enemy outside than the void within. This void terrifies him because it awakens shame. Beneath all his pride, beneath all his confidence, lies the fear of not being enough. Silence strips away the distractions that keep this fear hidden. In your quiet presence, he wonders, am I desirable? Am I worthy? Am I respected? These questions pierce deeper than any argument could, and yet, instead of giving him relief, you give him space to wrestle with them alone. That is why your silence lingers. It attaches itself to his self-doubt and grows there, long after you have turned away. But this is not only about him. Silence is also about you. It is about reclaiming the sacred center that noise tries to steal. To stay silent is to remember that not every provocation deserves your energy. Not every wound requires your explanation. Not every disappointment must be voiced to be understood. Sometimes silence is the highest form of truth, for it shows what words cannot, that your worth is not up for debate, that your presence is enough. A woman who learns this becomes untouchable because she is no longer dependent on external validation. Her silence says, I am whole, whether you see me or not. The Stoics would nod in agreement. Marcus Aurelius often reminded himself that one's dignity lies in control of one's own mind, not in the reactions of others. Silence is that control manifested. It is the decision to rise above petty battles, to stand as a fortress rather than a field. Epictetus taught that the only true freedom is mastery over one's responses, and silence is the purest form of mastery. For in silence you prove that no one dictates your rhythm, no one commands your peace. There is another dimension to this power: mystery. Words define, explain, clarify. Silence conceals, protects, and enchants. In silence, you are not fully known, and what is not fully known draws endless fascination. Men are hunters of meaning, and when you refuse to give them all the answers, they chase the ones they cannot catch. This is why silence is remembered long after noise is forgotten. It leaves unfinished stories in his mind, unanswered questions in his heart. He will replay the moment again and again, searching for clues. But what he searches for is not in you. It is in himself. And so, silence does what words cannot. It transforms. It breaks the cycle of endless explanation, the tug-of-war of egos. It interrupts the drama and points to something higher: dignity, sovereignty, depth. When a man encounters this, he is changed. He may grow, rising to meet the standard your silence reveals, or he may crumble, lost in the shadows it exposes. But either way, he cannot remain the same. He has been touched by the strange power of feminine silence, and it has carved itself into his memory. For you, silence becomes liberation. It frees you from the exhausting labor of proving, persuading, or performing. It reminds you that power does not always roar. It often whispers or says nothing at all. And in that nothingness lies everything: mystery, strength, and presence. Feminine silence is not emptiness, it is fullness contained, power restrained, wisdom embodied. And when wielded with self-possession, it bends the male psyche toward transformation, whether he welcomes it or not.
There is a silence that feels like abandonment, and there is a silence that feels like majesty. The first wounds, but the second awakens. When a woman carries herself with quiet dignity, she no longer begs to be understood. She demands, without words, that others rise to her level of self-respect. Men sense this difference instantly. The silence of resentment carries bitterness, but the silence of sovereignty carries weight. It is this weight that presses against a man's heart, this unshakable presence that makes him restless when you no longer offer explanations, no longer fill the air with words that soothe his ego. Carl Jung wrote that the soul speaks in symbols, and silence itself becomes one of the most powerful symbols of the feminine archetype. It is lunar, mysterious, magnetic. It invites without chasing. It commands without shouting. Men may not understand why they are unsettled by it, but their unconscious does. In silence you embody the Great Mother, the Queen, the Priestess, archetypes that live in every man's psyche, whether he admits it or not. When you stop speaking, you awaken those archetypes, and suddenly he does not face only you, but the timeless feminine within his own depths. This is why some men, when faced with such silence, feel compelled to speak endlessly. They confess, explain, justify. The silence draws their words out like a well draws water. Others retreat, overwhelmed by the reflection of their own inadequacy. And some, very few, are changed by it. They use that silence as a mirror, as a call to growth, as a reminder that they cannot remain boys demanding reassurance, but must become men who can stand in the presence of a woman who does not bow. But here lies the secret. The power of silence is not found in its effect on him, but in its effect on you. Silence is a ritual of self-possession. It trains your nervous system not to react, not to collapse into panic, not to throw away your power in the form of endless words. It teaches you the strength of restraint. The Stoics called this discipline, the art of mastering yourself so that no external storm can move you. In silence, you practice that mastery. You remind yourself that your value is not dependent on his recognition, that your dignity does not require his validation. To remain silent is not to be voiceless. It is to speak with your presence, to let your aura become your statement. This is why silence often feels more powerful than argument. It communicates without explanation that you are not seeking approval. It tells him that you are not negotiating your worth. And when a man feels this, he either steps into maturity or he flees from it. Either way, the silence has done its work. It has revealed who he truly is. Think of how the great Stoic emperor Marcus Aurelius carried himself. Surrounded by politics, betrayal, and the chaos of empire, he often chose restraint over indulgence, stillness over reaction. He understood that silence can be more commanding than speech. And so too, when you embody this in your own relationships, you remind men that power is not in noise, but in the depth of self-control. A man remembers this. He may forget your arguments, but he will not forget the day you stopped explaining. He will not forget the way you withdrew your energy and left him with his own thoughts. Silence is remembered because it is unfinished. Words close a chapter. Silence leaves it open forever. It lingers in the corridors of his memory, haunting him not with what you said, but with what you refused to say. And that refusal becomes a symbol in his life, a symbol of the woman who would not beg, who would not break, who would not chase. There is freedom in this for you. Silence frees you from the exhausting cycle of reaction. It detaches you from the need to be understood by those who cannot see. It returns you to yourself, to your own rhythm, to your own sacred stillness. You begin to realize that the greatest transformations often happen not in noise, but in quiet. Seeds germinate in silence. Healing takes root in silence, and the most powerful decisions of your life will rise not from chaos, but from the still voice within you. And so the strange power of feminine silence is not only the transformation of him, but the rebirth of you. For in silence you discover that you never needed to chase, to argue, to beg. You only needed to stand, to breathe, to be. And in being, you are enough.